Yeah, I mean, definitely a little bit of a gap there. It seems like people have started to and have adopted the virtual interviewing much more quickly. But you know, if we flip to the next slide, I mean, I did look at some third-party resources to just look at the what the trends when it comes to whether or not organizations, government agencies, universities, whether or not they are in fact looking for virtual hiring events. And so even if the adoption isn't there, you can see from this Google Trends slide, which kind of looks at how frequently people are searching on Google for a specific keyword. And I think the specific keyword here was virtual hiring events, which, you know, is like a virtual job fair. You can see the spike that occurred in the middle of March when the crisis and the pandemic hit. So, you know, adoption may be lagging a little bit, but I can tell you firsthand, and we'll look at some data here in a second. But you know, you can see it here in the Google Trends. Companies are scrambling to try to find out what they can do to bring their in-person events online. So if we look at our first questions here as it relates to virtual hiring events, and Peter, I'm going to get you prepped here. It's coming to you first. Um, we have two questions here, and I think they're two sides of the same coin. But the first is, you know, where and how do virtual hiring events fit into your recruitment funnel? And you know, maybe as a way to add some additional color to that, you know, talk about what are some use cases that you use virtual events for, either previous to COVID-19 or currently.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Joe. Yeah, I touched on this briefly up front, but I think that for us, we leverage virtual technology, virtual interviewing technology across the funnel. You know, we'll do broad reach events, whether they're with colleges or in a geography. We'll do kind of more select interview events, and then we'll do, you know, one-on-one Zoom interviews or FaceTime interviews to get to decisioning on candidates. I think, you know, for us, you know, we've been leveraging some versions of virtual hiring technology for several years now. It obviously has come to the forefront. I think what it really presses on for me again is that human connection, because the one element that you miss when you bring people on site, you know, if we bring them out to our Space Park facility, for example, we can take them and see the James Webb Telescope. We can take them and see the technology that we're working on. They get a sense for the corporate culture. When you're doing that virtually, you do have the interaction with the interviewer, but you miss the larger context. So I think, you know, really making sure that you're taking time to explore with that candidate in a real way what your corporate culture is, what their career trajectory may look like. It's beyond just the technology that you're using. It's how are you making that human connection to ensure that you're making the best decision, you know, both ways. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely, Peter. I mean, ultimately, the technology is just a means to an ultimate end. You have a greater purpose, and a technology is a part of that. Jen, I know that you know, you've also at Spectrum. Spectrum's been doing you know, virtual hiring events for some time. Can you kind of talk about where virtual hiring events fit in your recruitment funnel, and maybe a use case?
Sure. So our pre-COVID use case was actually in our sales and marketing channels. They specifically used it to follow up with individuals where we had on-site events that didn't show for whatever reason. And obviously the marketplace before COVID-19 and now is completely different. But in that instance, we didn't want to leave any stone unturned. And so we offered them, you never know what comes up for people. So we wanted to make sure we reached back out to those individuals and would do the virtual hiring events. Now how we're using them is in multiple different ways. So Joe, we got the opportunity to do one with you out to Hiring Our Heroes, which is one of our military partners, to make sure that we're teaching a broader audience. It's one thing to get our hiring managers bought into virtual hiring events, but it's also another thing to get candidates bought in. And so by doing this and doing kind of a goodwill opportunity with candidates, it's really important because a lot of people are not used to this. We're used to this because we use it all the time. How we're using it now from a business perspective is we are heavily using it in our call centers as we're still hiring. Our call volume is up. Everyone would like to still have their internet connected at home. And so, we just did an event last week in Kansas City with Brazen. And in most cases, we're using that in partnership with Indeed to make sure we're maximizing our exposure.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point too, and I think that we'll get into this maybe a little bit later, but it's one thing for the employers and the recruiting teams to adopt the technology, but we also have to remember that there are job seekers on the other end that are also trying to adopt all of these new technologies. So that's something that we have to all be thinking about. How do we educate them? I'll throw it over to you, Jane, at SAIC. How about you? Where does this fit in the recruiting funnel?
And I think it's across, everything that we do in our hiring funnel. Where we have seen the biggest success has been where we traditionally have had regular hiring events where our candidates were used to seeing us in the market anyway. But we turned those to virtual almost overnight. And I think we had the same number of people show up to those events as we had scheduled to meet us in person before COVID. So they've been really successful in those markets. In other areas, we're still working on adoption with the teams and the business, but but we're working it.
Definitely. All right, cool. So real quick, I'm gonna jump to the next slide. Tim, I think we'll get to you here in the next couple of questions, but we want to keep moving. So looking at our survey data, when we are looking specifically at the frequency of usage of virtual hiring events. So we did find from our survey results that 55.6% of those that were using virtual hiring events before are now using them more frequently. And then there's also about a third of respondents were not using virtual hiring events at all, but are now using them. So definitely an increase in frequency of usage. And if we jump to the next slide, just some further information or data here to kind of back this story up. Here at Brazen, we actually have seen just a huge increase in the number of events that our clients have hosted. So before the crisis, we were averaging about 100 events per week by Brazen clients. And you can see that that is up 3 to 5x here in the last month alone. And then also from the job seekers perspective, I think in general, and I'm sure Peter and Jane and Jen can kind of agree with this, you're typically looking at about a 50% attendance rate for job seekers, of those that register, 50% attend, but job seekers are looking right now, and we're seeing examples of that attendance rate being as high as 90%. So definitely more usage and more frequency of virtual job fairs. So if we jump to the next question here, it's another question here on virtual hiring events, and Jane, I'm gonna throw this one over to you first. Can you talk about one of your biggest hurdles in using virtual hiring events? I think as the data shows, there's still some hesitation from recruiting teams to adopt this technology or just the overall process of putting a career fair online. But can you talk about some of the biggest hurdles that your team has seen? And maybe along with that, one of the key features that have kind of helped you overcome that hurdle?
Yeah, sure. For us, I think it's predominantly because we work in a highly secure environment and with a company that has pretty low tolerance for risk. So getting technology approved and through all the security checks it can be a challenge, right? And then, and just by the nature of the work that we're in, I think there's some skepticism of, how is this thing going to work, and how, just skepticism is there. Luckily we did get that solution in place by late summer, and we were able to pilot it with a few groups successfully, and we're able to share those results. As far as the best feature for us, I think it's just being able to meet the candidates where they are, right? We're not limited by location. So it opens up the candidate pool. So, you know, if we were going to have a job fair in Huntsville, we're just going to see the candidates in Huntsville. Now we're seeing them from across the country.
That's awesome. And one of my biggest takeaways from that, and something that Peter Brooks has taught me, is that you can get anything approved by leadership as long as you present it as it being a pilot. That is the key to any technology adoption. So thank you, Peter, and thank you, Jane. That was fantastic. So I do want to keep us moving here. Let us jump to the last question here, I think, as it relates to virtual hiring events. And this is for you, Jen. Why don't you kick us off? But I think one of the hesitations or challenges with getting the adoption of virtual hiring events is, you know, thinking about how the heck do we promote these things, right? Like, it's not enough to just build it. It's not enough to just have the technology. How do we get job seekers there? So, Jen, can you kind of talk about, you know, what you're doing to get candidates to your career fairs?
Absolutely. So you have to always start with the usual suspects. So you've got to start with your career site and also leveraging social media, because those two things are already the tool in your toolbox that you probably don't have to spend any additional money on. And you can leverage your recruiters to share on their social handles as well. If you do have a little bit of money, I highly recommend partnering with Indeed to butt up against that, because obviously Indeed's still one of the largest pools of candidates in the world. And so it would be silly not to take advantage of that. But certainly don't forget about leveraging, you know, your talent community. If you have a database of people coming in, leverage that and use your CRM to make sure you're marketing out to those folks, to make sure you're inviting those individuals that is timely and based on their information and interests. But those are the best ways that we found to promote.
Awesome, Jen. Any other panelists want to talk about any other strategies?
So, Joe, this is Peter. I would just add that, you know, top recommendations, best practices for promoting virtual events. I think Jennifer just touched on several of them. But the only thing that I would underscore that is critical, I think, if you're going to leverage virtual technology the same way that you may have honed your in-person interviews, is that really, you know, you need to be driving to decisions. You know, get the marketing out there, leverage your digital marketing advertising agency, make sure you're targeting the right people. But when you get in front of candidates, I mean, yes, the job market has softened over the last month as a result of this virus and unfortunate layoffs. But demographically, the structural unemployment has not changed. And when this economy rebounds, it may not be necessarily a V, but it's going to be very tight. So use these opportunities just as preciously as you would a face-to-face interaction with a candidate.
Yeah, absolutely. We've heard examples of some of our customers that may not even be hiring right now, but are still hosting online virtual career fairs to just keep that conversation open, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Tim or Jane, any last thoughts on this question?
Well, I'll just jump in and say I think we'd be negligent if we didn't mention that we do have a programmatic advertising company on the line here who does do a pretty good job of promoting jobs as well. So I'm a big fan of Recruitix and their programmatic platform. So it's another great way to get the message out.